Yeah, the Woodrow Wilson Center, it focuses on foreign policy issues writ large, trying to become really a true forum for government, NGO, business researchers to talk about various issues. Now the China Environment Forum, we've been around for 16 years. We're basically a teenager this year, right? Ready to do big things. China Environment Forum, we were created early on really to focus on US-China clean energy and environmental relations. And climate and energy were some of the major topics in the get-go. And we've really become an information clearinghouse to help the US and globally, NGOs, business governments, to find ways to engage with China on environmental issues. We've done a lot of exchanges that focus on water issues, also clean energy. And most recently we've done a lot of not only exchanges but also on-the-ground research on energy water confrontations in China, particularly about coal's water footprint. That we've discovered through our research that about 20% of the water that's consumed in China, it goes to the coal sector. And so that's something that really helps raise the cost of coal in China.
In what ways, because China's in the news constantly and the pollution is everywhere and climate change, but in what ways are Chinese environmental issues spilling over to become international issues, and why should the world care?
That's a big question, and I could talk a lot, but let me just to kind of look back. But when I first started here working in this project 14 years ago, people looked at me like, China environment. They're like, no, China, our issues with China is security, right? And then big concerns about, safety, the military expansion in China. And environment was seen as a very low-level issue. I lived in China before, starting in the late 1980s, and I saw back then in many ways, the pollution potential that was happening in China because of their dependence on coal. And so over the years, China's air pollution has become front page news around the world. I mean, initially it was because, Chinese pollution was polluting Korea and Japan, but now it's very clear that their air pollution problems, a lot of it stems from coal, but also cars and also construction, that, the cities in northern China in particular have become just smog cities. But this pollution doesn't just stay in China. Obviously, we hear lots of stories over the years that the west coast of the United States, that their ability to meet the Clean Air Act requirements are being hindered because of coal pollution coming from China. But I like to think of it in terms of also, it's kind of a cash and carry karma of pollution here. Because a lot of our companies over the past 40 years have moved to China. We buy stuff that's produced in China at cheaper costs, but it is not that cheap. We buy them cheap, but because China has, they've opted to become the world's factory, they haven't been strong in enforcing their environmental regulations. So we export the industries, the pollution comes back to us.
So we're basically suffering from pollution to buy cheap products that we consume.
I mean, that's one of the reasons. I mean, but it's also that China's, their economy is 70% dependent on coal as their energy. I mean, every country needs energy, and like the United States, that our government, we also keep energy costs low. I mean, it wasn't until a few years ago that our coal dependency on coal dropped below 50% because of shale gas. But China, their pressure to grow the economy is very great. I mean the country, it's a one-party state, and the party and the government's legitimacy rests on economic development. So they have to keep the economy moving, and they have coal. Coal is, inexpensive because it's readily available. But I think now what we've really seen in the last couple of years in China is that they're seeing the cost of coal is not that cheap. You look at the air pollution problem. It's people are dying, a lot more from respiratory illnesses. Something like, 1.2 million people every year die early because of respiratory illnesses. Cancer rates have, according to Chinese statistics, gone up 80% over the past 30, 40 years. A lot of that is from air pollution issues, but then also water pollution is a huge environmental challenge facing them as well.
Okay, let me ask you about the carbon and climate emission costs, because this is a cost not just in China, but the whole world bears that. So are what kind of international measures are being taken or could be taken to deal with this?
Well, I think that, I mean, starting back in the 1980s, a lot of U.S. environmental NGOs started engaging in China on energy issues, particularly, focused on energy efficiency, renewable energy, because a lot of these groups saw early on that this was an important issue. But even back in the Clinton-Gore administration, Al Gore, he struck up, for the first time, a high-level agreement to have dialogues with China on energy and environmental issues. I mean, they said energy and environment, but, climate was the big motivator of this. And it was the first time where you had the US and Chinese government having multi-agency meetings, high-level approval to really push forward our cooperation. I mean, the US government has about 40, 50 protocols signed with China on energy and environmental issues. So basically, the international community has been engaged with China for 30, 40 years on energy and ostensibly climate issues. And the Chinese government has been very open to this. Inviting, the World Bank and bilateral and multilateral, and also, international NGOs working there. Notably on the climate issue, the Energy Foundation, which is headquartered in San Francisco, they set up an office in China about 18 years ago and have been giving lots of grants to Chinese government researchers and working with US groups that are working with the Chinese to help promoting clean energy development and policies. And in many ways, here's the kind of irony in China. Did you know that China is the #1 investor in clean energy technologies?
I knew they did it for export to other countries also.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's true. I mean, China produces most of the world's PV panels, but they also have, because of, the Energy Foundation and other foundations have been trying to help promote this kind of policy development in China. China, they invest heavily in wind and solar, working on energy efficiency policies. So the contradiction in China that's always kind of hard for non-China people to understand is China really has a green energy revolution going on, while at the same time they are still incredibly dependent on coal. And the reason that this contradiction keeps going on is that China's electricity production, their energy consumption doubled between 2000 and 2007. And it's in the process of doubling again. Because remember, we talked about China is the world's factory. Right. It's producing all this stuff. But at the same time, Chinese cities are expanding at an incredibly rapid rate. I mean, this is the world's fastest urbanization. I mean, in the next 10 years, another 350 million people are going to be moving to cities. And to build these cities, you need cement, you need steel, you need power. And so you have this kind of 1-2 punch of energy demand in China, where, the world's factory and growing their cities. And so they really do have huge amounts of clean energy developing in China, but it's just that the size of the energy bubble is so big that coal still is king.
So this is kind of a crisis and an opportunity.
Definitely, and I like that you use the word opportunity, because China has become a kind of laboratory for experimentation on some clean energy technologies, carbon capture, use, and sequestration. We've struggled in the United States to really get, we've set up various projects for carbon capture and little experiments on sequestration, but in China, they can do things at a scale and a speed that that we can only imagine in this country. And so, and that's been helpful too, to help bring down the costs.
Let's return briefly to smog and pollution, and because it's been crossing the boundary to South Korea, Japan, the west coast of the U.S. Again, is this more a crisis exacerbator where it's causing tensions between countries, or are there opportunities for more cooperation?
Well, I mean, about 15 years ago, Korea and Japan were really reaching out, and they actively, to China there's a tri-ministerial environmental meeting, and there's a lot of dialogue going on where the Koreans and Japanese want to help China, with the air pollution issue, reforestation, because some of the stuff that blows over to Korea and Japan, it's not just pollution, it's also sand, the desertification problems. but also sand can carry those pollutants with them. And so the Japanese and Koreans have been very, open to working with the Chinese on environmental issues. But then when we layer on, particularly between Japan and China, there's a lot of tension around the disputes over the islands, as you know, and that's made it increasingly difficult. And I think that Japan's engagement with China on clean energy and environmental issues has diminished, I think, considerably in the last couple of years because of these political obstacles. And so, it's unfortunate, because I feel that, not just, Japan and China, or US and China, but countries that work together on these mutually beneficial issues of clean energy and environmental protection, it's something that can help really build goodwill. And that's something that's sometimes sorely lacking, some countries find sorely lacking in their engagement with China.
Right. But unfortunately, environmental needs don't seem to be trumping other political considerations right now.
Yeah, I mean, but then let's turn back to the United States, that even, the US and China, that we have these tensions, we're like siblings that argue, right? These tensions always come up on various political and military issues, or security issues. But what's striking to me is that even though it's not always high level, environmental and energy cooperation has been very steady and growing between the US and China. Oftentimes it's the NGO foundation and research world that's probably the steadiest, but this means there's this strong network. I mean, the China Environment Forum, we see ourselves, we're at the hub of this network, this kind of global mafia on energy and environment, and that we work to bring people together, help being a matchmaker, but putting information out there about there are possibilities that the U.S. The U.S. is no leader, is in some ways is a leader on water energy confrontation, addressing this in the United States,
yeah,
but not great yet. And so this is but one area where the U.S. and China, in working together, can start making more progress.
Yeah, and I know on water issues you also have the Himalayan glacier melting and tensions with India. So again, do you see the dual, maybe there's opportunities for cooperation, but there's also danger of conflict?
Yeah, it's the China-India water issue. It's become a, for the Indians in particular, kind of a very sensitive issue. I mean, China, being the upstream water user, it's kind of they are ultimately in the position of power. That said, the Chinese central government has, over the last couple of years, been starting to hold conversations with India, saying that it would let the Indians know if they do start indeed building dams and diverting the water. But keep in mind, though, that it may be beyond the scope of where you wanted to go. But in India, in the Himalayan, the rivers that are coming out of the Himalayas, the Indian government is also, just like China, building lots of hydropower. They are also trying to tap this hydropower in China we refer to as kind of the dam rush. Yeah. I mean, China has the world's fastest expansion of hydropower construction in the world, but India looks at China as the model, and they are doing the same thing. We also see in Southeast Asia that they are also building dams to tap hydropower, in the Mekong and the Salween River basin. So it's an Asian-wide phenomena. Challenges those that, again, China is upstream, and they can change the course of the rivers.
Yeah, so they change the course in different ways, both as a leader and physically. But
then keep in mind, though, that even in southwest China, that China, that China is being invited by the Southeast Asian countries to actually, to come in, like Laos says, come on in, build these dams for us. And so, again, it's the same, everyone's trying to tap the hydro boom.
All right.
Sorry, that was mucked up.
And environmentalists don't even know, because on the one hand it's carbon free, on the other hand it has all kinds of environmental side effects.
It's not necessarily, it may be, low carbon, but there's also methane emissions coming from it. And in southwest China, because the water levels are going down, there have been a number of droughts over the past 3 years in China where they are building these dams. And we've discovered through our Choke Point China research that when Chinese are building dams, because they know that the water levels may be low, they also build a coal-fired power plant next to it.
Okay.
Because you have to keep the electricity moving, and a lot of that power, just to get that whole, remember that karmic circle I talked about earlier?
Right.
That the electricity that's produced in the hydropower, a lot of that is transferred to the east coast of China. And something like 25% of the electricity produced in China is used to make products for export. So that again, it's very important to realize that China's, their electricity, their coal, and their carbon problem is part of the big global supply chain.
And any final thoughts about how the Woodrow Wilson Institute and the China Environment Forum can help to mitigate and facilitate the situation and bring parties together?
Well, I mean, that's really, what we do at the China Environment Forum is that we act as a safe, nonpartisan forum. Not just here in DC. We do dialogues in China. We're also going to be soon, just give you an example, the kinds of stuff that we do, that we're going to be bringing together, hopefully, Oakland and Shenzhen cities to have discussions and looking at how both cities are dealing with water, energy, pollution confrontations. They're both port cities, very energy intensive. And so, that's just one example, the kinds of things that I find that there's a lot of enthusiasm, both in the US and China, to work with each other. And sometimes, when you're here in Washington, you hear the top level that, China,
especially the lower level.
I think state to state, because, but it also comes this way too.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of Chinese clean energy companies, they would love to invest in the United States. They have capital, we have needs, but sometimes that's made difficult. High level politics make it difficult. Companies maybe don't always feel that, Chinese companies don't always feel that comfortable necessarily investing here, that they maybe don't quite know how. But But I've really seen overall that there's a lot of potential for mutual benefit for both countries in working together, and and again we just keep slogging away, put on meetings, create publications, get information out there.